Cool. Well, hopefully folks can start to make their way back. We've got Kim Davis and Kyra Wolf here, fire ecologists at the University of Montana, here to talk about their work, specifically as it relates to post-fire regeneration in a changing climate, which is of course what this entire unit is about. So really excited to learn from them about their work. And I think they'll talk for anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a good chunk of time for Q&A. So as questions arise during this talk, please jot them down. Or if you already have questions, please jot them down, and we'll let them speak and then have the questions come at the end. So Kim and Kyra, thank you so much for being here. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks for having us. I think we will be closer to about 30 minutes of talking. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of how climate change might affect post-fire regeneration, and then I'll dive into a little bit of more detail on a recent project that I was working on. And then Kyra will talk about some work that she's doing. Yeah, and then we're happy to answer any questions. So I think we're all aware that we're seeing a big increase in fire activity across the Western US. And so as we're seeing more and more area burn every year, and this year is no exception, it's important to try to understand, what's going to happen after the fire to these forests. How will they recover? And it sounds like, that's what you guys have been thinking about for this whole unit. So maybe this will be a little bit of review for you. But historically, fire has been an important part of the ecosystems in the Western US, and most of the conifer species out here have some ways that they can regenerate. They're adapted to fire, but there's many different kinds of fire. And so some forests historically burned at low severity, where most of the trees survive the fire, maybe as frequently as every 3 to 10 years. And then other types of forests burn at a really different rate. So maybe they burn every 100 or 200 years, but they tended to burn at really high severity. So there's a whole range of adaptations that species have to deal with fire. But one of the reasons that people are concerned about what's coming back and if we will see post-fire recovery is because climate change is affecting both how fire is burning and how often and how severe, and also it's affecting the conditions that we see after the fire, in terms of how dry and hot it is, as I think we were just talking about. So there's a few different ways that climate change can impact post-fire vegetation, both indirectly and directly. And so one of the first ways is indirectly by changing fire size and fire severity. So with climate change, we're starting to see larger fires, and we're also seeing more area burn at high severity. And high severity is a measure of the ecological impacts of a fire. And there's different ways to measure it, but generally, when we refer to it here, we'll mean basically the percent of the trees that die. So if it's a high severity fire, all of the overstory has died. If it's a moderate or low severity fire, fewer of the overstory trees die. So when we start to see larger fires or more area burning at high severity, that will affect the seed availability on the landscape. And that's really important because many of the conifer species in the Western US depend on seeds dispersing into the burned area from unburned patches or patches that burned at lower severity to regenerate. So what this means is that a lot of recent work has shown that whether or not you see conifer regeneration depends a lot on whether or not you have a seed source nearby. So this distance to seed source metric, which is a measure of the distance to the nearest living tree, is really important in understanding where we see regeneration or not. So this is an example showing probability of a seedling on the y-axis and distance to seed source on the x. Each line is a different species. And so you see for most species, there's a big decline in the likelihood that you have regeneration if you have an increased distance to seed source. Lodgepole pine's an exception, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for most species across the West, they really need those seeds to disperse into the landscape. And so if we start to see larger fires or more area burning at high severity, that distance could increase. So this graph is showing the average distance to seed source in areas that were unburned, that were burned at low severity, moderate severity, or high severity. And this was a study in Idaho by Kyra. So Among her plots, the ones that burn at high severity tended to have these long distance seed source. So that's one of the reasons why they were less likely to have regeneration, is if they didn't have a seed source nearby. The one exception is lodgepole pine, which you can see here. It doesn't decline as much with increasing distance to seed source. And that's because lodgepole has what are called serotinous cones. And these are cones that are closed by this resin. And then when the fire heats up the cones open and the seeds disperse. And so fire is actually really helpful for lodgepole to disperse their cones, to disperse their seeds. And over the years in between fires, they build up what we call the canopy seed bank, for all these cones with all these seeds in their canopy. So then when the fire comes, there's just so many lodgepole seeds, which can result in this really, really dense forest. Like this is about 25 years after the 1988 fires in Yellowstone National Park. And that's just carpet of lodgepole. It's so dense, you barely can walk through that. So if we have these larger fires, it will affect different species differently. And maybe some of the serotinous species will be okay. And then also species that are really good at doing long distance dispersal might also do okay if we start to see larger fires. And so one example of this is aspen. And so here's some photos of aspen in Yellowstone. And then these are some photos of aspen seeds, which are really tiny. They have these little like white feathery things on them called apis. And those help those seeds get up into the air and fly really long distances. And so in some areas where we're not seeing a lot of conifer regeneration because there's no seed source nearby, we are still seeing a lot of aspen. So this is one of the changes we might see with larger and high severity fire patches. So if we see these larger areas burning at high severity, we might see increased distance to seed source, which will affect different species differently, but for most of the conifers in the West, that might mean a decline in regeneration. We'll also see changes in fire frequency. And because these forests all had different historic fire regimes, the effect of that will really depend on what type of forest you're in. So for example, in Yellowstone National Park, the forests are dominated by lodgepole pine, which is most of what you can see in this landscape. And these areas historically burned every 1 to 300 years. They burned at high severity, but like I showed you, there's so many seeds in the canopy that have developed over those 100 years that there tended to be pretty good regeneration following the fire. This is an example of an area that burned 28 years after the 1988 fires, and they're seeing very limited regeneration in these areas because there wasn't enough time for the lodgepole to develop that canopy seed bank. So they start developing cones when they're around 10 years old, but they don't have as many as older trees. So there's just not as many seeds available for these trees to regenerate. In other systems, increasing fire frequency for what we call short interval fires might have different effects. And so this is an example from the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, which is more of a mixed conifer system. It had ponderosa pine, western larch, also Douglas fir, also some lodgepole, but historically it burned at more of a mixed severity, more frequent fire regime. And so these areas tended to have more fire in the past, and then due to fire suppression and also the suppression of indigenous burning, we've maybe seen a decline in fires recently. And so in this area, what they saw was when they had these two fires in short succession, in this case, 8 years between the fires, it actually helped create a more resilient stand structure with a lower tree density, which was maybe what was tended to be there historically, and also lower fuel loads. So this area, if it burns again in the future, is more likely to burn at a lower severity, which will allow the ponderosa pine and these other tree species that can survive fire to survive that fire. So there can be really different impacts of changes in fire frequency depending on the forest type and also on the fire severity. So even in these areas where more frequent fire was common, if they burn twice at high severity, you're pretty unlikely to see tree regeneration, just again, because there won't be seeds left on the landscape. So yeah, changes in fire frequency, the effects will be really variable and context specific. And then the last and most direct impact of climate change on post-fire regeneration will be, of course, the conditions following the fire. And this is what my personal research has focused on. And so there's been a lot of a variety of studies in the last 10 or 15 years that have looked at how climate affects post-fire regeneration, comparing areas that tend to be drier to wetter sites, and generally they find in wetter sites that there's more regeneration. And so there's been some work like that, and there's also been some experiments where they plant seedlings and they see, if we make it hotter, how do the seedlings do? If we water, how do the seedlings do? And generally, if it's hotter and drier, seedlings don't do as well. But what our work wanted to focus on was figuring out what exactly are the annual climate conditions that are necessary for post-fire regeneration. So to do this, we needed to figure out what years trees established and then compare that to the climate conditions in those years. So what we did was we established 90 sites across all of the Western US, and we focused on ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, which are dominant species in the kind of drier mixed conifer areas. And we put all of our sites in kind of the drier areas where these two species could survive. And we did this because we were really interested in figuring out where is climate limiting regeneration and where is it not limiting regeneration. And so we went to all of these sites, and at all the sites, we dug up the trees and destructively sampled them. We did this because we needed to know exactly what year the trees established to figure out what the climate conditions were like in that year. So we brought all the seedlings back to lab, we aged them, and then we were able to see, in years with a lot of regeneration, what was climate like, and in years without regeneration, what was the climate like then. And so by doing this, we were able to figure out that the relationship between post-fire climate and post-fire regeneration or recruitment was not linear. We saw these sharp thresholds. So what I mean by that is that here I'm showing on the y-axis recruitment probability, and on the x mean summer VPD. And so I'm not sure if we've talked about vapor pressure deficit yet. So it's a measure of how dry the air is. So when the air is dry, it's pulling a lot of moisture out of these seedlings, and they get more stressed out. And especially if there isn't enough soil moisture, then they just will die of drought stress. So it's pretty similar to humidity. And so what we saw is that when we saw an increase in summer vapor pressure deficit, at one point, is what we call this threshold, we saw this big decline in recruitment probability. So once you cross this threshold, you're much less likely to see post-fire regeneration. We saw a similar relationship with soil moisture. So soil moisture of the driest month was the most important. And once you got above a certain threshold, you see a big increase in recruitment probability because there was enough moisture in the soil, so the seedlings didn't die of drought stress. Because we saw these like very sharp thresholds, we were interested in seeing whether or not our sites had crossed these thresholds in recent years, trying to understand, has climate change pushed us across these thresholds, or are we still kind of going up and down across these thresholds just depending on the year? And so what we did is we took the threshold that we identified in our models, and we laid it out on across this time series of the climate conditions at our site. So here's an example showing the mean summer VPD, again, how dry it is. So if you're up above this threshold, it's really too warm or dry for seedling recruitment. If you're below it, it means that climate conditions are really conducive to regeneration. Each one of these lines is the mean of all of our sites in each region. So we had California, Colorado Front Range, the Northern Rockies, and then the Southwest. You can see there's variability over time. So even in the 80s, you'd go up above and below this threshold, but increasingly over time, most of our sites tend to be above this threshold. These dots are each year when we saw the climate conditions drop below this threshold. So those are good years for recruitment. What you see is before 2000, there's a lot of dots. After 2000, there's very few dots. So that's just suggesting that these years that are good for recruitment are really declining over time. Another way to look at this is, so this is just the example of summer VPD, but we also want to incorporate soil moisture. So we used our model to predict recruitment probability over time based on the conditions at each one of our sites. And again, these lines are averaged by region. So when this goes up, those are years that are climatically really good for recruitment. And when it's down lower, those are years when the climate is not very suitable for recruitment or regeneration. And so what you'll notice is that, again, it's highly variable over time. And this agrees with a lot of work that's shown that ponderosa pine regeneration tends to be pretty episodic, what we call episodic. So like in cool, wet years, you'll see a lot of regeneration, but then in between, maybe you won't see as much regeneration. And because we studied specifically the drier sites, this is what we'd expect. But again, it's really clear that after about the year 2000, these lines pretty much flatten out everywhere except for in the Colorado sites. So what this suggests is that we have crossing thresholds, and climate change is really starting to affect the likelihood of regeneration at our sites. So that was just for our sites, but we wanted to know, what does this look like across the whole range of these species? And so this is, again, for ponderosa pine, but just projecting our models across the West. The colors are what we call the post-fire recruitment index, which is really a measure of the proportion of those first 5 years following fire that are suitable for regeneration. So in these dark blue colors, those are areas where all of the years following fire have climate that is conducive to regeneration. And these red areas are areas where basically none of the years, the first 5 years following a fire, have climate that's good for regeneration. And then we just average them by the decades. So the 1980s, the 2000s, which is 2000, 2010, and then also a future scenario of a global mean increase of 2 degrees Celsius. And the plots, the graphs down there, or the maps down at the bottom, are the difference between the 2 decades above. So what you'll notice is that in the 1980s, there's lots of blue. The 2000s, it turns a little bit more red. And then obviously in the future, we see a big decline in the climate suitability for recruitment. You also notice that even in the 80s, there's red down in the Southwest. And that agrees with a lot of work from down there that shows that regeneration events in some of these areas down in Arizona really only happen in these very exceptionally wet years. And then also I should say that these maps are at a fairly coarse resolution. So this is 4-kilometer climate data. So within any one of those 4-kilometer cells, you might have microsites or sites on like a north-facing aspect that might be more suitable for regeneration. So it doesn't mean that nowhere in this red area will have regeneration. It just means that, overall the climate conditions, the broad scale climate conditions, are not very suitable for regeneration. So basically some of my work in the dry mixed conifer forest, as well as other researchers' work in that type of forest type, is really suggesting that we might expect to see declines in post-fire conifer recruitment because climate conditions are increasingly unsuitable for regeneration. But that's the story in the dry mixed conifer forest, and I'm going to pass it over to Kyra, and she's going to talk a little bit more about some of these higher elevation subalpine and wetter forest types.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so let's see if I can. Oh, there we go. Sorry, it's a little slow to respond, but I'll work with it. So even with all of this evidence of declining tree regeneration in these low elevation dry forests, it's important to keep in mind that tree regeneration isn't necessarily declining everywhere. We expect that low elevation areas where it's warm and dry and close to the edges of forest distributions are going to be the most vulnerable to regeneration failures after fire due to climate being limiting. But in mid-elevation and high elevation forests, we often do see robust regeneration after fires. And here's a couple of examples of that from the Cascades in Washington, where you can see all of these trees coming back after fires. Some of these are in lodgepole pine forests, and some are in more mixed conifer forests with larch and other species as well. But even here, it still depends on the local context. So there is increasing evidence that even subalpine forest species are sensitive to drought conditions, just in general, and particularly after fires in drought years. And so this raises a concern about what these forests are going to look like in a world with more fire and warmer and drier post-fire climate conditions, and highlights the need to understand really what's controlling regeneration in these areas. And so forest regeneration after a fire depends on the net result of a series of demographic filters. So firstly, Kim kind of talked about this, you need seed availability. Seeds have to be there to be able to germinate and regenerate after fires, and that depends on having surviving trees to provide seeds and fire adaptive traits like serotinous cones and lodgepole pine. And secondly, you need those seeds to be able to germinate and establish, and finally for seedlings to survive and grow to maturity. And that depends really strongly on post-fire climate as well as other factors. And what we often find is that all of these factors together have the biggest impacts in the first few years after fire, such that early post-fire seedling recruitment is a critical stage in forest recovery, affecting what these forests are going to look like over decades to come after a fire. And so this is an example from a mixed conifer forest where over 90% of total recruitment happened in the first 3 years after fire. So you can see that this cumulative recruitment kind of tapers out after 3 years. And so given this importance of these first few years after fire for long-term recovery, we really wanted to understand how do climate and fire severity influence tree seedling establishment and survival over the first 3 years after wildfires. And so this is the project I'm writing up right now. It's not yet published, but it's in progress. We have all the data. So you guys are getting a little first look here. And we did this study really focusing on these mid and high elevation mixed conifer and subalpine forests in the northern Rocky Mountains. So this was in 2 large lightning ignited wildfires from 2017 near us in Missoula, Montana. And so this is a much more limited study than Kim's. We're focusing on a specific area in specific years. But the nice thing about that is that we were able to revisit the same sites a whole bunch of times to get data from the first 3 years after the fires. And so in these areas, we had 69 plots spanning gradients in local climate through elevation and aspect and fire severity, sampling in unburned, moderate, and high severity fires. And at each plot, we counted the total number of seedlings and we set up these little subplots where we marked individual seedlings and tracked them over time to estimate survival and growth over the first 3 years after the fires. And what we found is that seedling density was pretty abundant in these areas in the first 3 years. So this graph on the left shows post-fire seedling density on the y-axis against pre-fire tree density that we reconstructed on the x-axis. And note that this is a log-log scale. So our seedling densities varied really widely from like 10 seedlings per hectare to over 500,000. So that's a lot of variability, but more than 2/3 of our sites had more seedlings after the fire than there had been trees, mature trees before the fire. So that suggests that overall these forests are likely to recover and be resilient to these fires over the long term. And this regeneration was the result of robust annual recruitment in the first 3 years after fire. So this left-hand figure shows annual regeneration densities on a log scale in burn sites over years 1, 2, and 3 after fire. And this first year had really quite a lot of regeneration, and a lot of that was from lodgepole pine regenerating from serotinous cones. And the other side of this story is also that survival was surprisingly high in these sites. In burned areas, total survival of seedlings over the first 3 years was above 50%. And so that's higher than expected. And in fact, it was higher than in our unburned sites. that's suggesting that fire was really opening up opportunities for regeneration in these plots. And so to answer the question, what controlled seedling regeneration in our study areas, we used statistical modeling to model total regeneration density in burn plots in the third year after fires against a set of different variables that can explain that regeneration. So that's what's shown here. This is regeneration on the y-axis. And we found that firstly, seed availability was really important, consistent with what we would expect. Regeneration was higher on average in sites with more lodgepole pine trees to provide serotinous cones, and in sites closer to live seed sources. Secondly, we found that fire severity was really important, but had variable effects. So regeneration was higher in sites with greater overstory mortality and canopy loss, but lower in sites with higher nitrogen availability, where fire actually releases a lot of nitrogen into available forms for plants to use. So these are kind of unexpected contrasting effects, and we need more research to really tease apart what's going on here and how species might differ in their responses to these factors. And then finally, we found that climate was also a really important variable, where sites that had higher average maximum temperatures in the summer had lower regeneration on average. And so that reflects differences between sites in topographic position, where sites at higher elevations would have lower temperatures, and sites on north-facing slopes that get less sunlight, less solar energy coming in, would tend to have lower temperatures. But another thing that's unique about this study is that this climate variable is actually based on measured temperature near the ground surface in the field, which is closer to what seedlings are experiencing than, for example, gridded climate data that a lot of studies use. And so we actually had sensors out in the field measuring this, and this gets a little bit more closely at that risk of desiccation for seedlings, where air temperature and humidity and soil moisture are determining how much drought stress they're experiencing during the summer. And that's affected both by these larger scale climate patterns, topographic setting, and the surrounding vegetation structures that provide shading and cool things through evapotranspiration. And so another question we were interested in answering is, how does fire affect microclimate? And these effects can be pretty large, because in like an intact forest with live canopy cover, that canopy is going to intercept sunlight and cool the understory through transpiration. So some of the sunlight goes into evaporating water and therefore does not go into making heat. But in a burned area where all those trees are dead, the ground surface is directly warmed by sunlight, and there's a lot less of that evaporative cooling, so there's more heat being produced. And measuring this, we found that microclimate conditions were substantially warmer and drier in burned sites than unburned sites. So this is showing temperature on the y-axis and vapor pressure deficit, which Kim explained earlier is basically a measure of how dry the air is against time of day. So this is sort of like the average daily cycle of temperature and atmospheric vapor pressure deficit over the growing season, separated out by fire severity. And so you can see that the biggest impacts of fire, or the biggest differences between burned and unburned sites, is in the hottest part of the day. And we also found that the effects of fire on microclimate were the most pronounced in high severity sites with large losses of canopy cover, in cooler, wetter sites such as north-facing slopes, and during the hottest part of the season. So this is showing you daily maximum temperature over the growing season in 2018. So this is the first year after the fire. And you can see that, that these curves are sort of averaged over all of our plots, but separated out by fire severity. And And so you can see that this difference between burned and unburned is much bigger on north-facing slopes than south-facing slopes. So these cooler, wetter topographic positions actually have bigger effects of canopy loss on microclimates. And you can see that these effects are much bigger also during the hottest part of the growing season, so in July and August. And so this suggests that as we have more area burned at high severity and warmer and drier climate conditions in the summers, seedlings are going to be exposed to larger microclimatic extremes. And that could increase the risk of desiccation in burned areas and just make it harder to regenerate. And so in summary, we found abundant seedling regeneration in the first 3 years after wildfires, but this is a context-specific finding. We wouldn't see the same thing in all years in all places, but here we did. We found that regeneration was highest in sites with greater seed availability and cooler, moister microclimate conditions with some complex effects of fire severity. And we found that the microclimate conditions experienced by seedlings are harshest in severely burned areas and when ambient temperatures are hottest. And the implications of this are that seed availability is likely to increasingly limit regeneration in these forests if we have larger high severity patches in the future. And Kim kind of talked about this, the same mechanism holds for these higher elevation forests, although lodgepole pine regeneration from serotinous cones would contribute to forest resilience, even in high severity fires. And seedlings will be increasingly exposed to harsh, warm, and dry microclimate extremes due to climate change, which could limit regeneration in these mixed conifer and subalpine forests. And this is most likely in areas of high severity fire and could even occur on more protected, cool topographic positions like north-facing slopes. And so overall, how can we expect our forests to change in a future with more fire and warmer climate conditions? First, we might expect that at these lowest elevation areas, the climate will become unsuitable for regeneration, as Kim's research is suggesting. But in these mid-elevation and high elevation forests, we can expect more likely that there'll be shifts in forest structure and species composition as these forests adjust to different climate conditions. And fire might actually accelerate that adjustment by providing opportunities for different species to regenerate. And that is all I have.
Great, thanks so much,
Thank
Kyra.
you, Kyra. I have just like 2 more slides.
Great.
Okay, so we just want to touch on briefly, some of the options that managers have when they're facing these burn landscapes, because depending on what agency they work for, some of them have mandates where they need to reforest these areas, or they have to manage some of these areas. And so as they're seeing more and more area burning, and also these different climate conditions, they're kind of facing a really difficult situation where they're not sure what to expect, but also it's hard to manage for historic conditions because conditions are changing. And so there's been a lot of work recently on something called the Resist, Accept, Direct framework. And so this has been developed by managers and scientists, largely from federal agencies like the Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And it's a framework that really encompasses like all the decisions that managers have in the face of climate change. So they can either try to, as things are changing due to climate change, they can either try to resist those changes, they can either accept those changes and really not be too active in their management, or they could direct those changes. So for example, if they think it's changing in one direction, but they need it to change in a different way to meet their management goals, maybe they'll try to direct change to some more desirable state. And of course, across any landscape, where they choose these different options will vary. So they probably won't say everywhere on our forest we're going to resist change, but they might try to target different areas for these different options. And so, which will depend on a lot of like complex social things, as well as policy, as well as like just feasibility of doing different options. So in the context of post-fire vegetation change, what we can think about is resisting change would really mean trying to get what was there before the fire to recover after the fire. And some of the ways that they could do this include things like fuel reduction treatments, which would happen before a fire, but then would decrease the chance of high severity fire. And so then you have less chance of like a whole ecosystem transformation after the fire, because you still have the trees that were there before the fire living after the fire. And also then they can provide more seed source to the areas that burned at higher severity. And this is really a more appropriate treatment in areas that historically burn more frequently, like dry mixed conifer forests. So then the other option to resist changes is to try to plant after fire. And so increasingly, many agencies are trying to plant trees after fire, but as we're seeing these drought conditions, in some areas they're really having a lot of trouble getting trees established. Like for example, in the Southwest, they're having a hard time getting ponderosa pine seeds to grow in these burned areas. So there's been a lot of silvicultural research into ways that they can make that more successful recently, like exposing seedlings in the nursery to drought, and then they're more hardy when they plant them out in the landscape, or thinking about where and how they're planting those seedlings to increase the chances of survival. The next option is to accept these changes, and because in a lot of areas we don't exactly know what's going to happen if we don't see these forests recover, it's really important in these areas to monitor these changes. And then that way, if something comes up, then they can take management action later. And then the final action is to direct these changes maybe to species that are more suitable for the future conditions. So for example, planting drought and fire resistant species, even if those weren't the dominant species before the fire, maybe you want to transition your landscape to this more drought and fire adapted landscape. And so one of the ways to do this is through either assisted migration or assisted gene flow. And these are ways that we can kind of accomplish what Kyra was talking about that might happen naturally, where you see the shift in species composition, but kind of helping it out because trees, they have a hard time moving. They can only move as far as their seeds disperse. So assisted migration is where you're moving whole species to new areas, which obviously has a lot of ethical and just a lot of issues to consider before that happens. So that's not something that's being done really widespread. But assisted gene flow is this idea of taking the same species, but taking populations from lower elevations that might be locally adapted to warmer and drier conditions and moving them up in elevation to try to kind of track changes in climate. And so this is something that there's increasingly more research about. And so, for example, we just started an experiment this summer where we were planting Western larch from a lower elevation up at higher elevations across an elevation gradient in this area that burned a couple years ago. So we have planted both a low elevation larch and then also like a mid elevation larch where the seed source elevation matches the elevation where we're planting trees. And so that's typically what the Forest Service does. They match the elevation of where they get their seedlings from to the elevation where they're planting it. And so we're testing if you bring these lower elevation seedlings up, does that help them survive in these warmer and drier conditions? So we've planted about 1,000 larch. We've tagged them all. We measured them all. We have microclimate sensors out there measuring soil moisture, measuring temperature and humidity. And so this just happened this summer. So I don't know how many survived, but we're wondering if, this really, really hot summer that we're having in Montana is going to be a good test of if these lower elevation seedlings are maybe better adapted to these really hot and dry conditions. So with that, we just would like to acknowledge all our many co-authors, our field helpers, and also our funding sources. And then we're happy to take any questions.
Wow. Thanks, Kyra and Kim. That was awesome. And, every single paper that you were referencing seemed like 2017 to 2021 or hasn't even been published yet. So obviously an expanding field of research and one that's of extreme relevance right now. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share your work with us. I saw in the chat a question from Amy. And I think, Kyra, this came up during your talk. It had to do with, I don't know if you can see, I'll read it aloud, but with different rates of regeneration in higher elevation areas, are there the same species of trees replacing what was lost in the fire? or are there different species coming in, especially as temperature changes are happening at higher elevations? If, for example, white bark pine survival challenges, issues at higher temperatures.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that would get at that like shift in species composition. I'm not aware of research that's actually tested that's showing shifts in species composition necessarily, or at least large shifts. In my study, the species that were coming in after the fire were ones that had been present before, at least in small amounts. The relative numbers might change a little, but it's also, we're looking at pretty early after fire. So some of that can shift as well as the forest kind of matures, and there's some more thinning out. So I don't know, but yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I think that's like a pretty open question that, people that we work with, we talk about this and are trying to address this with some of our data. And some, there's been some studies where they like in Glacier, for example, Brent Harvey was looking at post-fire regeneration, and he kind of was expecting some of these mid-elevation species to move up, but he wasn't necessarily seeing that yet. So that's just one example, but I think in some cases dispersal might be limiting some of these shifts, or if they're shifting, they're not shifting like very long distances yet.
Great, thanks. And another one coming, given similar latitude in Europe, did they show similar 40-year data regarding regeneration trends on their native species? So are we seeing this, is this unique to the Northern Rockies in the Western United States, or are we seeing this at similar latitudes in Europe? Or do we know?
Someone probably knows.
Someone surely knows. I have no idea.
I don't know specifically for recruitment data. I know for sure that like tree die-offs due to drought mortality and insects that are associated with drought is definitely a global phenomenon that we've seen everywhere in the world. But I can't off the top of my head think of like 40-year recruitment data sets from Europe, which I'm sure exists, but I'm just not as familiar with the literature in Europe.
Great, thanks. And this is a great question. Bree's talking about how she likes to discuss future careers with her students related to topics she's teaching, and is wondering if you could briefly explain some of the different ways my students could get involved in this work. And also, to kind of build on that, not only how students could get involved in this work, but, maybe a story about how you got involved in this work as well, and what brought you on this career path that you're all on.
Yeah, well, there are lots of career opportunities in forest management and research in general. A lot would be like through the government or through conservation organizations like Nature Conservancy or things like that. But there's lots of different sort of levels at which people get involved with this type of work. Kim and I are both in the academic track, but there are certainly like more on the ground management careers that people do. For myself, I got interested in this really in grad school. I went to college in Colorado and got really interested in fire there. I worked in a lab that studied post-fire carbon cycling in soils and got just really excited about that. I was generally interested in environmental issues and ended up deciding that I wanted to go more into research and came here to study paleoecology, so looking over very long time scales, how does fire respond to changes in climate and how does that affect ecosystems? And as I was here involved in this lab, the work that Kim was doing, and just generally this exploding field of research on post-fire regeneration was really exciting to me. And I applied for a grant and got funded to do this project. And so this is part of my dissertation work, but that's kind of my trajectory. And it's been really fun because it gets me out in the field in recently burned areas, like working with seedlings, and I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Kim?
So I just add, there's a lot of applied, like, I work with people from the Nature Conservancy who are silviculturalists and are out there managing land, like making decisions about where and what to plant and managing planting contracts. Then there's the tree planters that come in and plant trees. There's firefighters. There's a lot of different ways to get involved besides doing research. And I would say for younger people who want to like test this out and see how interested they are, there's a lot of great opportunities through organizations like, for example, Montana, we have the Montana Conservation Corps, where they do all different types of conservation work, some of which might be involved in like fire restoration, or like the SCA has summer internships as well. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to get involved in internships in the summer to kind of see, like TNC has an intern program at the Montana office. And so I've taken that intern out with me to do field work. So I think there's a lot of opportunities like that for younger students to get involved and see like if they're interested in this. I got interested in this, I was just started being interested in ecology because I love to be outdoors. So I just decided to major in ecology in college because I like to do the outdoor field labs instead of being in a lab. And then just thought it was all really fascinating, understanding how everything worked. And then just randomly was looking for field jobs my first year after college, and I started working for the UC Berkeley Fire Science Lab. And I grew up on the East Coast, and then moving out to California and going in all these burn areas, I just thought it was really fascinating to see what was happening after these fires. And so that kind of just determined my trajectory, and I just kept working with fires since then.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. I think we'll take a couple more questions here. And Sir has a question about what are some fire-resistant plants? We talked a lot about lodgepole pine, but what are some other fire-resistant or fire-adapted plants?
Well, Western larch and ponderosa pine are two of the most fire-resistant. So they're most likely to survive fires instead of dying and then having to regenerate because they have really thick bark. And so up to certain fire intensity, larch and ponderosa pine, and also Douglas fir, these species that have really thick bark, they can survive certain fires that would probably kill like lodgepole pine or subalpine fir or Engelmann spruce, which are species that have really thin bark. And so the thickness of a bark will determine whether or not the tree can survive because that bark is protecting the cambium, the insides of the tree from the heat. So those are the ones that we typically think of like fire resistors. But then there's the species like lodgepole that do really well coming back after fire. And then there's a lot of species of shrubs, grasses, other plants that can resprout. So they can be killed on the top. Oh, an aspen, for example, that can be killed on the top by a fire, and then they can regenerate just by sprouting from the same roots that were already there after the fire. I don't know if Kyra has anything to add.
Kyra, I'm gonna throw one more question your way before we wrap up here. I really appreciate you all giving us so much time, and there's a question kind of thinking about fires in the past, seed regeneration in the past, and I think that some of your work recently with Phil out in Montana, looking at wildfire changes over the last 2,500 years, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of shifts in fire patterns over the last 2,500 years, kind of related to a question I saw in the chat, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting to sort of compare the changes we're seeing over the last few decades in terms of we do see this really robust pattern across the West of increasing area burned with these long-term patterns over thousands of years. And over this long term, we do see this really strong link between climate and fire. So when temperatures are warmer or cooler, we tend to see more or less burning generally across the West. And then in the last 100 years or so, it's a pretty robust pattern of fire decreasing with increasing like human land use and fire suppression and suppression of indigenous burning. which has then now sort of that decline has reversed with the increasing impacts of anthropogenic climate change. And we do, even though there has been long-term climate variability in the past, we do know that this current pattern is due to human impacts on climate. Like the atmospheric carbon dioxide that we see is the highest that it has been in millions of years of Earth history, even through interglacial cycles. And so that's really robust evidence that humans are contributing to this current spike in temperatures, which is drying out fuels and just really loading the dice for these really large fires to occur and much increased area burned in the past few decades, and even just the past couple of years, we see this really strongly. So myself and Phil just had a paper come out actually directly comparing area burned in 2020 and in the 21st century in general with the past 2,000 years in subalpine forests in Colorado. And we were actually able to make that comparison and show that the current rate of burning that we're seeing is unprecedented, at least on that time scale, the last 2,000 years. So that really is pretty strong evidence for this role of humans.
Great, thanks, Kyra. So yeah, it's scary stuff, right? Anthropogenic warming leading to more larger fires of larger size. We're seeing more of the landscape being affected, and really important work to understand how these landscapes, these fire-affected landscapes, are going to recover or not. So really, thank you for your work. This is really important work, and it's really, I wish I had seen and listened to you all before writing this curriculum. I'm looking forward to making some revisions, adding some of your work to it, and also want to encourage those of you that are here, educators, the unit as written is a framework. Please take what Kyra and Kim have presented here today. We'll make sure the recording and their slide decks are available, and build upon this framework. Bring in seedling presence, vapor pressure deficit, aspect, all of these other variables that are important. So thank you, Kyra and Kim, for being here. We really appreciate it.